The Kiev-Pechersk Lavra Museum, English translation, Introduction. Dear visitor, we welcome you in our museum. The Ukrainian Museum of Books and Printing was founded in 1972, during UNESCO's International Book Year. The museum is situated in one of the most beautiful and holy places in the entirety of Ukraine, within the location of the ancient printing monastery at the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. This was the first printing press in eastern Ukraine, which worked constantly for over 300 years, from the beginning of the 17th century right through to the 20th. Our museum became the first to be dedicated to books during the era of the Soviet Union. Index 1. The appearance of the first books gave an early indication of the writing at the time. Archaeological items bear witness to the various forms of writing in the ancient lands of Ukrainian. We can see signs of ancient writings found on parchments near the village of Lyutish, north of Kiev, in the 7th and 8th centuries. The learned Bulgarian monk Hraber wrote tracts in the 9th century describing graphical ciphers that the Slavs recorded previously in the lands of Ukraine, who also understood numerology and the measurement of time. In the second half of the 9th century, teachers Kyrillo and Methodian, along with their followers, created two forms of the Slavic alphabet, Cyrillic and Alaholic. The most ancient memory of Alaholic writing is the handwritten book from the end of the 10th century, the Kievan Alaholic pages. This is the Slavic translation from the Latin of the Western Christian Church service. Our display shows a copy of the original, which is kept at the V. Vernadskoho Ukrainian National Library in Kiev. In the territories of Ukraina Rus, Cyrillic writing became more prevalent. Cyrillic differentiated in a variety of ways, such as the geometric strokes above certain letters at an equal height and space in between, and also removing gaps between certain words. Regarding the development of writing during the 11th and 12th centuries, the archaeological findings of graphic depictions exist upon the walls of caves, monasteries, and in elm wood carvings at Volhynia, Novgorod, and Halichina. With the official acceptance in the year 988 of Christianity in Ukraina Rusi, stronger political and cultural ties were established with Byzantium and Bulgaria, from where a steady flow of church service books appeared. In the 11th century Kiev, a royal calligraphy house was formed, with master script writers and translators, who created texts and scripts on parchment, embellished with elaborate ornamental and miniature graphics in a Byzantine style. In Kiev, during the first half of the 11th century, the book of Saint Evangelist was created, which at a later date was named Saint Evangelist of Rheims, after the place where it was kept. It's known that the book was owned by Anna, the daughter of Kiev's king Yaroslav the Wise. Anna went on to marry King Henry I of France in the year 1049. Anna kept hold of the book of Evangelist after moving to France, and as a consequence the book remained under the care of the French monarchy for 300 years. The most ancient and accurately dated handwritten book of Ukraina Rusi is Ostromerova Evangelii. This large format codex was created in the Royal House of Calligraphy in Kiev under the care of scribe Gregory, or Hrehoriim, and his helpers, upon the request of the leader of Novgorod, Ostromera Josefa. The creative work took almost 7 months, with all the text written entirely in Ukrainian. Alongside translated literary works in Cave Rus, there appeared completely unique and original literary forms. The oldest chronicle, which still survives with us now, is called the Chronicle of Days Past, upon which work took place until the year 1113. The creator of these writings was the celebrated historian Nestor of the cave Pecherska Lavra. His main mission was to explain to future readers how the land of Russia was created, who the first royal rulers were, and why the country became so at the time. Around the year 1187, the Cave Chronicle mentions the name of Ukraine for the first time. At the end of the 12th century, the highly poetic creation named The Word of King Ihor's Regiment became a pearl of the Kievan Rus artistic literature, with its authors unknown. Within its pages is told of King Ihor Sviatoslav of Novhorod-Siversk and his fateful assault with his allies upon the Solovtsi people in the year 1185. The Word was a passionate patriotic call for the unity of the land of Rus before the Tatar-Mongol invasion. These handwritten texts were published in book form in the 19th century by the well-known collector and lover of antiquity Musin Pushkin. Along with Malinovsky and Bantysh-Kamensky, the first edition appeared in 1800. The edition that you can see is extraordinarily priceless, as the original was destroyed by fire in Moscow during the war in the year 1812. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the fragmented cultures of Ukraine entered into a most difficult time. The lands of Ukraine had been ravaged by war with the Mongol Tatars, then became a feudal state, overrun by the Hungarians, Latvians, and Poles. In the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a noticeable lack of books in Ukraine. Long-established centers, such as the Kiev Calligraphy House, began fresh writings. Particularly active book writing took place in the town of Volhynia. The writing mainly centered around the Dermansky, Zemnensky, Zahorivsky, and Peresovnitsky monasteries. The greatest Ukrainian artistic book of the 16th century became the Peresovnitsky Evangelii. The flavor and phraseology of the Peresovnitsky Evangelii stands out for being written in purely Ukrainian words and language. This is particularly prevalent within the section of Luke as part of the Evangelii: Chlopche, Klunya, Stodola, Zrodilo, Stalosia, Dyakoval, and others. Within 150 years, this book came into the possession of Hetman Ivan Mazepa, who passed it on as a gift to the Vosnesenskoho monastery within the cathedral of Pereyaslav. Later, the book was kept within the library of the Pereyaslav Spiritual Seminar. The first person to begin teaching about the contents of the Evangelii was the well-known Russian historian Osip Bolyansky in 1838. It wasn't long before Taras Shevchenko had read the book and realized its extraordinary meaning and beauty. And so, not by chance, has the book become an integral attribute of Ukrainian presidential inaugurations. A copy of this ancient item was presented to our museum in 2008. Index 2. Book printing in Europe was invented during the epoch of the late Renaissance. It was a real revolution in the development of world civilization. In the 4th decade of the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg of Germany used a printing press and practically introduced hot metal typesetting. The first printing press produced items such as schoolbooks on Latin grammar, calendars, and the Bible, one of the masterpieces of the Renaissance culture. Researchers have determined that this edition numbered approximately 180 items. Parts of them were printed on parchment, but mostly on paper for the book form. The first Cyrillic printing houses began functioning in Krakow, Szczecin, and Venice. The decisive step in the further advancement of printing in the East was made by Belarusian Franciszek Skaryna, who was the first Eastern Slavonic printer. He studied philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow and undertook medical studies at the University of Padua. His editorial activities started in Prague, where in 1517 to 1519 he printed 23 books of the Ruska Bible in Belarusian. Later he lived and worked in Vilno, now Vilnius. Skaryna was one of the first Slavonic editors who used the numeration of pages and simplified his book's language and print to make it more understandable, in order so that it could be understood not only by doctors and learned people, but also by any common reader or listener. The beginning of regular printing in Ukraine was connected to the name of Ivan Fedorov, a skilled master who had come to Lviv from the Belarusian town of Zabludov. In 1564, Ivan Fedorov founded regular printing in the Moscow state. Before long, court intrigues compelled him to move to Zabludov, which belonged to the hetman of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, Hryhory Chodkiewicz. There he published the Didactic Gospels in 1569 and the Psalms in 1570. The first printed book in Ukraine was Apostolos, published in February 1574 by Ivan Fedorov in his own printing house in Lviv. The book contains a very interesting epilogue telling about the Lviv printing house's history and the printer's work. Ivan Fedorov is the author of first Eastern Slavonic printed alphabet books. In 1574, the ancient Slavonic alphabet book, including exercises in reading and basic grammar, was edited in Lviv. In 1578, the publisher printed Azbuka, or the alphabet book, for the simultaneous studying of Church Slavonic and Greek languages, and then Bukvar, or ABC book, the second edition of the one published in Lviv that contained an additional work by the ancient Bulgarian historian of the 9th century, Chernorizets Rabar, an account of letters, where he wrote on tallies and sketches, as it was translated in English. The last edition of Fedorov was the Ostrog Bible of 1581, which is written monument of world significance. Through the joint efforts of the Cultural Educational Society, professors of the Ostrog Academy and the prominent political and cultural figures Knyaz Konstantin Basil Ostrozky, the first full translation of the Slavonic Bible had been created. 6 prints, including 2 Greek prints, were used for its production. According to data presented by Jakim Zapaska, the book contains 3,240,000 printed ciphers. This is greater than in any other editions published by Ivan Fedorov. Also, this edition is the first to contain a title page. From then on, all Ukrainian books had title pages that only began to appear in Russian editions during the second half of the 17th century. After Ivan Fedorov died in 1583, the equipment of his printing house was pawned, but was rescued by the Lviv Assumption Stavropihinian fraternity, who continued the work of the first printer in western Ukraine. Fraternities initiated church reforms, founded libraries and printing houses, and took part in the revival and sponsorship of the national school. Index 3. The Lviv Assumption Fraternity Press published divine service literature, textbooks, and grammatical editions of copies in their thousands. Old designs by Ivan Fedorov and Pamvo Berinda were used for decorating the editions. In the middle of the 17th century, the works by engravers Ilya, Eustafi Zavadovsky, Georgi, Dorofei, and at the end of the century, the creations by Nikodim Zubritsky became examples of this high art. In 1636, the printing house of the fraternity edited the first Gospel in Ukraine. The Gospel, splendidly designed with illustrated scenes, had become a model for the next editions of this most important book for the divine service. The edition had been realized by Mikhailo Slyozka. The printer ran the press of the fraternity, and in time founded his own printing house, where within 30 years more than 50 Orthodox and Catholic editions were brought about. Slyozka was the author of the publisher's forewords, containing philosophical speculations, examples from ancient history, and words of gratitude for sponsors. After the death of the master, his press was bought by the Lviv fraternity. Index 4. At the beginning of the 17th century, the role of the Kiev-Pechersk monastery in the religious, cultural, and educational life of Ukraine was intensified. It is possible, owing to the vigorous activities of the archimandrite Yelisei Pletenetsky, who, according to M. Hrushevsky, opened a new epoch in the life of the Ukrainian asceticism stronghold, and transformed the Pechersk monastery into the first and foremost cultural power. In approximately 1615, Yelisei Pletenetsky founded the Lavra Press in Kiev, which helped him to unite the intellectual elite of Ukraine. As a result, the elite started to defend spiritual values, language, and artistic traditions. The Lavra Press inherited the dust-covered equipment of the Sryatin Press of Fedir Balaban. A wooden house, being an exact copy of the image engraved on the print of 1638, was built on the steep mountain behind the altar wall of the Assumption Church. A brick building, in the Cossack Baroque style for the printing house, had been erected at the beginning of the 18th century. In the middle of the 19th century, a story designed by Pavlo Sparo was added to the house. It was restored in 1951 to 1954, after ruination during the Second World War. The most ancient Kiev editions that have come to our notice are the Books of Hours of 1616 and the Menaion of 1619. In 1627, the prominent lexicon Slavenoroski by Pamvo Berinda had been published. The dictionary contains interpretations of about 7,000 words and word expressions. It had played an important role in Church Slavonic and Ukrainian language development, including native and foreign dictionaries. There is a fragment of the ancient printing house interior in the exposition. The main instrument of printers, a wooden workbench, like in Gutenberg's time, was the press. In the premises of the Lviv printing house, 6 wooden presses were at work. With the help of each of them, a printer and his assistant called Batershchik, a derivation from Italian battitore, printed pages of the future book, and 2 typesetters composed the text of the book out of separate metallic letters. The typesetter stood in front of a type case and took letter by letter out of its frame, composing words, lines, and pages of the future book, then putting them into the typeset. Finished pages were given to the printer, and he put them onto a movable type press. The batershchik, or assistant, drew paint onto the metallic letters, and so the printer pressed the pages. About 1,000 imprints could be produced with the help of the press per day. Copyists, however, could rewrite no more than 4 pages within this time. Index 5. Particular progress of cave typography was made during the time of the Metropolitan Petro Mohyla between 1627 and 1647. Aiming at the reform of liturgical practices and strengthening of the Orthodox Church, Petro Mohyla published the Prayer Book of 1646. The artistic value of this edition is presented with the series of 19 engravings and woodcuts by the master Ilya, illustrating different devotions. The Prayer Book has been an original church encyclical. Prayers and devotions had been described in it, 37 of which neither Greek or Russian analog versions even existed at that point. These are church articles for the consecrating ceremonies of such things as a cemetery, of a new monastery foundation, of laying the foundation of a new city, a fortress, benediction rituals of a new bakery, a new well, crops, cattle, a new boat, salt, and many other things. All of it shows that the Orthodox Church in the 11th and 12th centuries was indivisible from the life and the way of life of the Ukrainian people, sanctifying and blessing people's work and its harvest during a year, as well as the whole life of a believer, beginning from birth until death. The Prayer Book by Petro Mohyla, as well as the Metropolitan himself, had been anathematized at the Moscow Synod in 1690. Only 3 centuries later, the anathema had been cancelled, and Petro Mohyla was canonized. Under the supervision of Petro Mohyla, the Lavra printers had started the preparation for the publishing of the remarkable literary monument of 13th century Kiev-Pechersk, namely, the Lives of the Fathers, that was realized in 1661 in the times of the Archimandrite Innocentia Giselle. Index 6. Considerable contribution into the development of the Ukrainian book printing had been done by the Ukrainian church figures Leonaki Galiatovsky and Lazar Baranovich. The prominent preacher and the head of the Kiev-Mohyla Collegium, Leonaki Galiatovsky, published in 1659 the collected Baroque sermons, Key for Understanding. The book is aimed at the teaching priests how to suppress Sunday sermons. It was supplemented by the first European textbook of predicant eloquence. In 1666, Lazar Baranovich edited the collected sermons for the Christian moral strengthening under the title Spiritual Sword. Baranovich invested a lot of effort and costs into the strengthening of the emblematic art in Ukraine. The book had been worked out simultaneously by a poet and an artist. The poetry has become the image, and the image has become the poetry, as it can be seen from the title page. In 1674, the synopsis, under the editorship of Innocenti Giselle, came out that was the first printed historical work presenting a consistent and systematic account of the native history beginning from the ancient times and up to the end of the 17th century. It underwent about 30 re-editions, and for more than a century was the only textbook in history in Ukraine. At the end of 17th century, the Lavra printers began publishing the monumental work Hagiography by the prominent Ukrainian church and cultural figure, the prelate Dmitry, the Metropolitan of Rostov. This edition took many years because of censorship. By 1686, the Ukrainian Church had finally submitted to the Moscow Patriarchy. The Kiev-Pechersk printing house editions underwent strict censorship. In 1690, the council that gathered in Moscow denounced many of the Ukrainian books and cursed and anathematized works by Petromohila, Lazar Baranovich, and Leonely Galiotsky. In 1720, the Tsar Peter I of Russia issued an edict on the mandatory censure of Kiev and Chernihiv editions in order to acquire the absolute correspondence with the great Russian ones, and the order that there be no difference and no special dialect, meaning the Ukrainian language. In the Books of Apostles of 1722, it had been marked for the first time that the book entirely resembles the Great Russian. In 1758, the second Ukrainian but the first Kiev edition of the Bible was issued. The Lavra Belfry, the Assumption Cathedral, and the one-storied building of the printing house, as it was restored after the fire of 1718, were pictured on the title page of the book. In the first quarter of the 18th century, in the Lavra printing house, the unique book of festive Irmosis, or Irmologion, had been created. In it, manuscript, stamp, and printing techniques were combined. Index 7. Bibelots and small format editions are also exhibited in the showcases. The Book of the Apostles of 1737, containing Baroque meteorites by the prominent Ukrainian engraver Hrehory Levitsky, is of special value. The Bishop Lazar Baranovich founded the printing works in Novgorod-Seversky, aiming at the dissemination of the Ukrainian author's works. Shortly after that, it moved to Chernihiv. Polemical works, Baroque poetry, sermons, textbooks in Ukrainian, Polish, Latin, and Church Slavonic languages were published in it. The exposition also contains the Tragedion Colored of 1685, where the dedication to L. Baranovich and his emblem have been placed. The influence of the Tsar's edict on the prohibition of the Ukrainian printed word had affected the work of the Chernihiv printing works. These were decades when in Russia publishing of diverse research works, practice books, textbooks, fiction books, as well as historical and philological treatises began whilst the Chernihiv printing house was suppressed. Its control came to the replication of the edited earlier Divine Services books, in which all the Ukrainian peculiarities of orthography and language had been extirpated. In the third decade of the 18th century, a printing house had been founded in the Pochayev Assumption Lavra, and it functioned until 1918. Its first edition was Diurnal of 1735, illustrated by Andriy Holota and Yosef. The Altar Gospel of 1718 contained beautiful engravings by Yosef and Adam Gochemskis, who were considered to be among the best Ukrainian engravers of the second half of the 18th century. Except for the Divine Service books, the first printed anthology of the ecclesiastical Ukrainian poetry, Bohoglasnik, and the first book of catalogue had been published in Pochayev. In 18th century, printing works functioned at many Catholic monasteries and Jesuit schools. The books were printed in Lviv, Pochayev, Berdechiv, Univ, and other cities. The exposition contains collected sermons in Polish. The museum possesses the collection of wooden artworks of the 18th to the 19th centuries made by the Lavra masters. Specifically, these are title frames, headbands, tailpieces, and illustrations for Oktoichas and Kiev-Pechersk Lives of the Fathers. Exhibited is the 1883 edition of Lives of the Fathers and its illustrations. Index 8. In the course of time, expensive parchment gave place to the cheaper material of common paper. The technology of paper production out of plant fiber and ragmass had been worked out in China. It came to Ukraine owing to Italian colonies in the Crimea in the 13th century. The paper manufactured abroad, in Germany, Poland and France, was used for the first domestic prints. Documents and watermarks prove the presence of the paper industry in Ukraine in the first half of the 16th century, in the town of Yaniv in the Volyn region. The paper was made out of old cotton and linen rags, collected by raggers, people who scouted and searched their regions and exchanged old rugs for small household goods, such as needles and soap, etc. Their goods were sent to the water paper mills built on river banks, then graded, watered, and milled into a homogeneous mass by special millstones set in motion by water energy. Then the textile mass was cooked for a long time in big cauldrons mixed with alum or natural soda. The sieve-shaped receptacles were filled with the prepared liquid mass. This work demanded real virtuosity. 4 grams of the paper mass had to stay on the bottom of the sieve, measuring 50 centimeters multiplied by 40 centimeters. Watermarks had been embroidered with silk on the sieve bottom, or netted with thin wires, in order to stamp the brand. A trademark was obligatory at the time. After the paper had been dried out, it was glued with animal glue or gelatin. It was glossed and pressed. The entire manufacturing process was actually very seasonal. The history of old art-mounted books is rather interesting. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as well as under Kiev Rus times, pages of the book, earlier rewritten and now printed, went into bookbinders' hands. He sewed pages into the block and fixed small wooden planks, which were then covered with leather or a cloth. Decorations on the leather cover were then imprinted with the help of smoothers, rolls, and punches. The art of mounting emerged in Ukraine when the first manuscripts appeared, and up to the beginning of the 15th century had been developing according to the Byzantium art traditions. The book printing developed favored the dissemination of the Western European methods of the book jacket design. In the 15th century, the blind or uncolored stamping was joined in the first half of the 16th century with the addition of gold and silver. This type of setting was used throughout the 17th and 18th centuries and lasted until the beginning of the 20th century. The book edge was painted, gilded, and decorated with stamping. Index 9. The metallic adornments for the settings had been widespread in the second half of the 17th and 18th centuries. Precious metal settings were created in gold, silver, and copper, along with colored enamels, as well as blackening techniques. They were produced by masters of different trades, among whom were jewelers, and they played a key role. They were also called goldsmiths in Ukraine. You are now familiar with the history of the manuscript and age-old books. Now we are going to turn to the section of Ukrainian book printing of the second half of the 18th to the beginning of the 20th centuries. Second section, Index 1. From the formation of the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 18th century, Ukraine lost all remnants of its former independence. Up until the 18th century, Ukrainian books rarely came into print. Only books assigned for the church or schools were printed. Nevertheless, just as in earlier times, Ukrainian writers' works existed in manuscript form. However, the progress and rise of the cultural needs of society provoked the revival of European book printing. Books did not remain an acquisition of the minority owing to the reform of printing during 1710. Instead of the bulky, archaic Cyrillic alphabet, the more convenient civil ABC was introduced. Our exposition contains a showcase with the revised alphabet and the written direction by Peter I of Russia concerning the new alphabet usage. Along with the spread of the new print, the church book gave way to a more secular version. At the very beginning, civil printing in the Russian Empire was limited to Moscow and Petersburg. The first Ukrainian printing works to use the civil alphabet was founded in 1764 in the St. Elizabeth's Fort, now Kirovograd. Shortly after that, civil printing houses appeared in Mykolaiv, Kiev, Berdychiv, Zhytomyr, Kamianets-Podilsky, and other Ukrainian cities. The first Kiev civil printing house had been founded in 1787 as a division of the Kiev Mohyla Academy. Here a lot of textbooks and scientific works were published. We should mention the books of the prominent historian, bibliographer and metropolitan Yevgeny Bolkhovitinov of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra description and the Kiev-Sofia Cathedral description, copywriting for which he delivered to the Lavra. A new page of the printing work's progress of strengthening its material and technical resources and the diversification of print contents is connected to the name of Bolkhovitinov. A new epoch of civil book printing in Ukraine opened at the beginning of the 19th century, when the network of the secular secondary education institutions widened and the first universities were opened. The outstanding event of the social and cultural life in Ukraine in 1834 was the grand opening of the Kiev University, which to the present day has been the leading higher institute of education in Ukraine. The printing house at the university was founded the same year, and it issued mainly textbooks and scientific works. The exposition presents the first edition of the poetical translation of the poem The Tale of Igor's Campaign, translated into Ukrainian dialect by Mykola Maximovich. As well as being the book's author and packer, he was also the prominent domestic researcher and the first president of Kiev University. Public life expanded along with the opening of the university, with a rise of interest towards the history of Ukraine. In 1843, in Kiev, the Interim Commission for the Age-Old Deeds appeared. It published numerous archive materials from Ukrainian history in the printing works of the university and at Valna, where they had their own lithograph and the first fast printing machine in Kiev. Soon, Kharkiv became the most important publishing center. In 1804, the university had been founded, and the next year the printing house started functioning. The initiative of their opening belonged to the scientist and inventor, as well as the public figure Vasil Karazin. His contemporaries called him the Ukrainian Lomonosov for the universality and versatile character of his scientific research. In the 30s, Kharkiv won first place in book publishing. Within the first 50 years of its work, above 600 different titles had been issued. Kharkiv was also the cradle of Ukrainian journalism. During the first half of the 19th century, 12 periodicals had been issued. In the literary collection Molodek, poems by Shevchenko, works by Kvitka Osnoyamenko, Kostomarov, and others were published. Ukrainian collection by Sreznevsky, begins with the play by Kotlяревsky called Natalka Poltavka, or Natalka from Poltava, which was the first edition of a work that had already existed in manuscript form for over 20 years. Editions that appeared outside Ukraine, in Moscow and Petersburg, were all of Ukrainian significance. The ideological formation and creative progress of prominent Ukrainians such as Shevchenko, Kulish, Marko Vovchok, Rebinka and Maximovich were also connected to Russian cities, as well as the publishing of considerable numbers of scientific works, folklore collections and fiction that were real treasures of Ukrainian classical literature. In 1798, Aeneid by Ivan Kotlяревsky was issued for the first time in Petersburg. This was an edition that marked the beginning of the new Ukrainian literature and the new Ukrainian book. Taras Shevchenko highly appreciated its creator. The printer of the Aeneid was in favor of the growing interest towards Ukrainian works, and became a positive influence towards further initiatives in the realm of the Ukrainian language and book publishing. The first collection of works within a different genre was by prominent Ukrainian enlightener, philosopher and poet Grigory Skovoroda, entitled Works in Verses and Prose, as well as other works on Ukrainian history, philosophy, ethnography and folklore. Grammar of the Little Russian Dialect by Alexei Pavlovsky was the first edition of Ukrainian language grammar. Experience of the Age-Old Cantos by Mykola Tseterlev was the first edition of the Ukrainian folk dumas, or epic songs, and such like. It was due to the first signs of the printed Ukraina that the interest towards the history and culture of Ukraine arose, which manifested itself in book publishing revival. Second section, Index 2. The issuing of the first collection of Taras Shevchenko's poems under the title Kobzar in Petersburg in 1840 became an outstanding event in Ukrainian history. It contained only 8 verses, but according to Ivan Franko, this small booklet opened the new poetry world at once. Kobzar marked the beginning of the new epoch in the history of Ukrainian literature. The name of its author became a symbol of the Ukrainian people's invincible spirit. 3 more editions in Shevchenko's lifetime took place in Petersburg. They were Cheherin Kobzar, Haidamaki, and Hamalia of 1844, and the last in the poet's lifetime edition of Kobzar, edited at the cost of the manufacturer Platon Semerenko in 1860. The last book edited while Shevchenko was still alive was South Russian Alphabet. The circulation of it constituted 10,000 copies, with the price of each being 3 kopecks. Shevchenko was only a great poet, but a talented artist and an engraver as well. For his achievements as an engraver, he was awarded academic status. Contemporaries called him the Russian Rembrandt. Following 17th century copper plate engravings, 19th century etching became prominent in Ukraine. Printing of copper plate engravings and etchings were done with the help of etching presses. Shevchenko had been attracted by the possibility to make about 500 impressions with the help of one original plate. Let us remember that this museum has been situated in the building of the Lavra printing house, which, at the time, was actually visited by the great poet. He made sketches of favorite corners of the Lavra and wrote about it in his book, Twins. In the first half of the 19th century, the Ukrainian book was a completely fortuitous phenomenon. Tsar Nicholas II's regime, which was characterized by Shevchenko at the time as silence in all languages, ended with the Sevastopol rout. The powers of the time had to compromise for the sake of their own continuing existence. A thaw had begun within the printing world. In 1857, within the revigorating atmosphere of the social and political as well as the cultural movement in Russia, on the eve of the agricultural reform of 1861, Panteleimon Kulish and Danilo Kamenetsky founded the first Ukrainian printing house through the sponsorship of Tarnovsky, Galagan, and Simerenko. Kulish was also the creator of the first historical novel, Black Rada, and the first editor of the series of popular Ukrainian books under the title Countryside Library, that contained 39 titles of books. Except for the books by Shevchenko, Marko Vovchok, and others, Kulish edited his own works and the works of his wife, Anna Barvinok. Kulish was the first who challenged the prohibition to print the works of Shevchenko in exile, and integrated the part of his David's Psalms into his own Grammar. Grammar was the first publication to try and combine the Ukrainian primer and the book for reading. The thaw in the censorship of Ukrainian book printing was brought about by the Valuev Circular of 1863, which determined to uphold the Ukrainian book publishing progress. The teaching in schools of Ukrainian literature and textbooks had been prohibited by decree. The blow was felt at the most vulnerable points, because the 1860s generation were interested in advancing the idea of the cultural awareness, and paid much attention to the most popular literary editions. While in 1856 to 1863 there was a steady rise in the number of Ukrainian publications, a noticeable decline followed in 1866. In Moscow, the printers Selivanovsky and Glazunov published Ukrainian books by Beketov, and through the university pressworks. The prominent Slavonic scholar and the university professor Osip Bodyansky issued over 100 volumes of readings containing the most important sources of the history of Ukraine and the mode of life of Ukrainian people. You can see in our exposition the Samovidets Chronicles, regarding the emergence and origins of Slavonic characters by O. Bodyansky, and Ukrainian folk songs by Maximovich, which marked the beginning of the Ukrainian folklore studies as a science. Gogol and Bodyansky actively participated in the preparation of the book's edition. In 1822, The History of Little Russia by Dmytro Bantysh-Kamensky was published in Moscow. It was based upon the scientific sources of Ukrainian history that were for the first time processed and used in academic research. The first page opened onto the portrait of Pavlo Polubotko, whose activity is a bright example of devoted service to Ukrainian culture. The hetman, or king, was tortured to death in Petropavlovsk fortress. He did not betray his cultural position, and courageously said to Peter I of Russia, "I'm far more concerned for the death everywhere of my fellow countrymen than anything you can do to me for defending my motherland." At the beginning of the 19th century, book printing enjoyed wide progress in Odessa, where, in 1804, the first theatre on a regular basis was opened. Clubs, museums, and bookshops were founded, and 7 printing houses were in operation. New scientific associations in the city also helped to widen printing editions. In the Western Territories, Ukrainian culture underwent the national suppression of the Austrian-Hungarian government. Until the 40s of the 19th century, there were no printing houses interested in creative print. There were very few books edited, and the ones that were printed in archaic Cyrillic alphabet. Mainly they were published in Polish, German, and in Old Slavonic. Due to the influence of the Ukrainian editions in the early 19th century, some were spread in Nadpyryanska Ukraine, and some reached Halichina, where the interest towards the collecting and publication of Ukrainian amateur and folk art grew, and the literary activities of the progressive youth, headed by the Greek Catholic students Shashkevich, Vahilevich, and Holovatsky, the so-called Rus Trinity, intensified. In 1837 they edited in Budapest the prominent Dniester Mermaid, which was the collection of folklore and public literary works. There was an edition of 1,000 copies, 800 of which were immediately confiscated. Ivan Franko called the fate of this edition a complete revolutionary phenomenon. In the 1870s, Kiev became the center of the Ukrainian cultural movement, where the most eminent scientific and literary figures were active, such as the composer Lysenko, the writer Staritsky, the linguist Zhetetsky, the student of folklore Chubinsky, historians Antonovich and Dragomanov, who all worked in what was known as the Kiev Old Community. In Kiev, scientific editions were to be printed only in the Russian language. The first who violated this prohibition were members of the southwestern branch of the Russian Geographical Society, who were exiled to the northern part of Russia because of their activities. Dragomanov had to leave the country. In 1882, the historical ethnographical magazine Kiev Old Times was issued. It published many articles about old Ukraine, and a library was attached to its editorial office. In Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and Odessa, historical ethnographical societies had been founded, as well as in the early 20th century, the public society of Prosvita, that conducted an active cultural, educational, and editorial work. The editorial activity of Kiev Prosvita, led by B. Hrynchenko, deserves some special attention. The next stage in the progress of Ukrainian book printing starts in the middle of the 1890s, when public publishing houses and societies were founded not by businessmen, but by young Ukrainian cultural activists. The first Ukrainian publishing houses were Age and Time in Kiev, Boris Hrychenko's publishing house in Chernihiv, and Disseminator in Kharkiv and Cherkasy. Ukrainian Rus publishing associations in Lviv issued works by Shevchenko, Franko, Lesya Ukrainka, Stefanik, Hrynchenko, and other prominent writers. The initiative in the matter of the Ukrainian book publishing revival belongs to the true fighter for the Ukrainian book, the pedagogue and the writer Boris Hrychenko. In 1894, he organized the publishing of Ukrainian books in Chernihiv at the cost of local landlord Cherevatenko. 50 new book titles appeared, with editions of 5,000 to 10,000 copies of each. There were the collection of the prohibited works in Russia, works by Pavlo Hrabovsky, Kobza, the scientific work Ethnographical Materials, Ukrainian Antiquities and the Museum Catalogue by V.V. Tarnowski, and many others. The indefatigability of the publisher, his ingenuity in getting round the censure, his permanent desire not only to publish a book, but also to spread the word, is truly striking. The publishing house called Age, or Vik, conducted especially active cultural and educational activities. In the main, its members were students. Our exposition contains one of the best editions of the Age publishing house, which is the Ukrainian literary anthology in 3 volumes dedicated to the centenary of Aenida by Kotlяревsky. Vasil Simerenko endowed 300 karbovancy for its issuing. It was the first profitable edition after which the publishing house got its title Age. No other publishing house of Nadnipryashchina could compare to Age in diversity and number of the production, though the publishers were to work under hard censure restrictions and limits. For example, out of 230 manuscripts submitted for consideration of the censure, they managed to publish only 80 works. Censure persecution in Russia caused the concentration of the publishing businesses in Halachina. In the late 19th century to the early 20th century, the role of Lviv as a cultural and publishing center of Halachina increased. The intensive activities of the intelligence group headed by Ivan Franko and Mikhailo Pavlik favored this. The scientific society named after Shevchenko and founded in 1873 in Lviv on the initiative of Eastern Ukrainian writers, Alexander Konusky among them, published very significant volumes in its subject matter. It was especially active in the 1890s, when Mikhailo Hrushevsky headed the organization. Franko, Hnatyuk, Pavlik and others were integral parts of the organization. The joint periodical of the Scientific Association after Shevchenko was called Notes, or Zapiski, that started to come out under the guidance of Hrushevsky since 1896. Many important fiction editions appeared. The fullest collection of Shevchenko's works were being exposed. This is Kobzar, under the editorship of Ivan Franko of 1908. Literary and scientific bulletins played an important role in uniting art representatives of eastern and western Ukrainian territories. Until 1906, the magazine was edited in Lviv, and in 1907 began to come out in Kiev and Lviv. It covered literary, scientific and social issues. Lviv's Prosvita, founded in 1868, also maintained a very wide publishing activity. There is the fullest of all existing editions of works by P. Kulish in 6 volumes from 1908 within bookshops of the Scientific Society after Shevchenko, and of Prosvita in Lviv, and from bookshops in smaller towns of the time. In the second half of the 19th and early 20th century, Petersburg and Moscow were still very important centers of Ukrainian book publishing. Moscow publishers had performed great services publishing books by the prominent researcher Levko Zimirenko, called The Crimean Industrial Fruit Growing. While being a manuscript, the book was awarded the big golden medal at the contests dedicated to the 50th anniversary of the Emperor's Russian Association for Horticulture. The exposition also contains the edition of the work by the Ukrainian historian and folklore student Mykola Zakrevsky, called Cave Description, and Folk Sons of Halych and Hungarian Rus, collected by Y. Holovatsky. The scientific, literary, social and political monthly magazine Ukrainian Life began being issued from 1912 till 1914 in Moscow. The prominent historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky was among the members of its editorial board. From 1898 until 1917, the Philanthropic Society of Petersburg widely propagandized Ukrainian popular books. It was the first and the only legal Ukrainian publishing house of the time that specifically aimed at the publishing of popular scientific literature. Within 20 years, it published a library containing 80 titles, with editions of above 1 million copies. The Society prepared the fullest edition of the time of Taras Shevchenko's Kobzar under the editorship of Vasil Domanitsky in 1907, which contained prohibited and unpublished earlier verses. 10,000 copies of the book were sold within 3 months. Second section, Index 3. The Tsar's government policy towards Ukrainian books remained very strict. Another blow fell following the issue of the Ems Ukaz in 1876. At the time, when new restrictions were superimposed on the Ukrainian language, The Free Ukrainian Press, founded in Geneva in 1876 by Mikhailo Drahomanov at the cost of the Kiev community, actually did very important work. It printed fiction prohibited in Russia, as well as the popular and scientific works of the socialist orientation. The collection of the critical social character community, we might say, was edited. Franco wrote that since the end of 1876, Geneva became the center of Ukrainian thought, if not of the Ukrainian movement, for the next 20 years. Dragomanov's editions were illegally sent to Ukraine, but the authorities did everything possible not to let them get to their readers. In the showcase Foreign Editions, there exists the most important editions of Ukrainian literature printed abroad, in particular the booklet New Verses by Pushkin and Shevchenko, printed in Leipzig 1859, where Zapovit, or Testament, by Shevchenko under the title Thought has been printed for the first time. Prominent figures of Ukrainian culture attached a big importance to the Bible as a source of the national and cultural revival of the nation. However, it could not be printed in Ukrainian. It was only in 1901 when the professor Ivan Pului made a contract with the British Bible Society in order to purchase all the translations of the Bible by P. Kulish. In January 1904 it had been issued under the title Old Writing of the Old and New Testaments, translated by Kulich, Levitsky, and Pului. Later, the Metropolitan Ilyaron marked that, for the first time, the full printed Bible in the live popular language appeared. It was a great historical event in the spiritual life of Ukraine. Second section, Index 4. Until 1905, there were no periodicals in the native language in eastern Ukraine. Literary collections and anthologies to a certain extent substituted the printed press. Representatives of Ukrainian culture had no permission to publish periodicals or series editions. So, to get around the censure, they united for the edition of group collections. The edition of the almanac Rada became an event of considerable public and cultural value. The title page of it contains the autograph of its producer, Mikhailo Staritsky, the prominent Ukrainian writer and publisher. Only after the manifest of the 17th of October 1905, the periodic press started to appear with the efforts of different social and political groups. In our showcase is the magazine Ukraine Illustrated, which was one of the leading editions of Halichina, organized according to the examples of big illustrated European magazines. It contains reproductions of pictures by the most well-known world and Ukrainian artists. For a period of time, it was published under the editorship of the historian Ivan Krepyakevich. Second section, Index 5. The Kiev-Pechersk Lavra remained the most influential publishing center of the second half of the 19th century. Its editions distinguished themselves with high-quality printing, relatively low prices, and considerable yearly circulations of about 340,000 copies of different titles, and about 12,000 copies of works of art. Most of the editions were printed in the Church Slavonic language, with pictures and postcard images of the Lavra, churches, and saints being issued. The income totaled about 70,000 rubles a year. The Lavra editions were spread not only in Russia, but also in Bulgaria, on Mount Athos, and in Bukovina and Serbia. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Lavra Library possessed a precious bibliographic collection. Only the age-old books of 16th century ran to 16 examples. The catalogue of the Lavra Library, the first full edition of the Bible in Russian, textbooks and divine service books, are being exhibited. In the 19th century, the art of the Ukrainian book had started to revive. Artists began to illustrate the works of Ukrainian writers. The first to illustrate the whole poem Haidamaki by Shevchenko was Opanas Slastion. He created 50 drawings that were the first effort to illustrate the work on the history of Ukraine. A significant contribution to the historical genre in Ukrainian graphic art development, and an example of artistic design in the modernist style, became the album Ukrainian Old Times, published in Petersburg in 1900, with drawings by Vasilkivsky and Slastion, and a foreword by the historian Dmytro Yavornitsky. Lithography spread at the beginning of the 19th century through stone printing. The lithograph press and a fragment of the print from the Christmas carol New Joy Has Come are exhibited. Second section, Index 6. During the second half of the 1870s in Nadnipryanshchina, in particular in the cave edition of the popular fictional scientific literature, was livened up by the most progressive figures of Ukrainian culture. Staritsky, Olena Pchilka, Hrynchenko, Hnatyuk, and others started to pay more attention towards books for children. Different kinds of books with folk tales appeared for children. Mikhailo Staritsky was the first to introduce Andersen's fairy tales to Ukrainian children. Beautiful illustrations to the edition were created by the artist Mykola Murashko. The writers had to fight for each Ukrainian book, so the permission to print Robinson Crusoe, translated by Hrynchenko, was issued only after the 6th request for publication. In our showcase, Foreign Languages editions, we can see the book by the Polish writer and critic Michailo Hrabowski, Past and Present Ukraine, written in Polish, which speaks about the ancient settlements within the territory of Ukraine. In the second half of the 19th century, considerable changes took place in printing in Kiev. Kiev was the main center of book publication, over and above Petersburg and Moscow at the time. At the beginning of the century there were only 2 printing houses. By 1897 there were 22. The printing works of Stefan Kulzhenko was most respected. Its editions, for example, the album Kiev Now and Then, were distinguished by their artistic polygraph realizations and their artistic designs. Evidence of this are golden and silver medals of a variety of exhibitions. Not by chance that in 1919 the banknotes of the Ukrainian People's Republic printed these familiar designs. Second section, Index 7. This part of our science section opens with the portrait of Ahatanel Kremsky, who took an active part in the compilation of Ukrainian orthography, and who spoke above 60 foreign languages. On the dawn of the 19th century, the lexical collection had started its interpretation within the pages of the Kharkiv and Petersburg editions of the Fundamentals magazine. Within the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of a 2-language dictionary was underway. The final touches were compiled by Boris Hrychenko in the compilation of the Ukrainian Language Dictionary in 4 volumes, including 68,000 words. Today, it is still one of the most authoritative sources of the language. In its entirety, it presents the wealth of the Eastern and Western Ukrainian language. The activities of Ukrainian researchers in the realm of social sciences had been quite successful. Volodymyr Antonovich, Mykola Kostomarov, Alexandra Yefmenko, Dmytro Bahali were among the historians of the second half of the 19th century who studied Ukraine's past as an independent state system. Each nation has its own major historical figures. Mikhailo Hrushevsky was one of them. He was the prominent researcher, tireless investigator of the history of Ukraine, a fighter for its independence and sovereignty, and the first president of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917 to 1918. He wrote about 2,000 popular scientific works. In our exposition, we can see the first comprehensive research of the history of Ukraina Rus. Mykola Pirohov was a devoted doctor, pedagogue, and an enlightener. He supported education reforms and was the first organizer of Sunday schools in Ukraine. In our showcase, we can see his book, a collection of literary and pedagogical articles. All money receipts went towards the establishment of Sunday schools. Other importantly related books in language, history, literature, philosophy, legal history, and arts history are also exhibited here. The activities of domestic scientists in the realm of applied sciences also had quite an effect. One of the founders of the science of bridge building was Yevhen Paton. The fourth edition of his work, Tables for Iron Constructions and Bridges Calculation, is exhibited here. The book by Ignatovich Zawileski, Electric Tram in Kiev, tells about the opening of the first tram line in Kiev in the Russian Empire of 1892. Professors of schools and universities were the authors of textbooks for schools and higher schools. The foreword for medical microbiology had been written by Ilya Mechnikov, our first fellow countryman who was awarded the Nobel Prize. Scientific works, textbooks in physics, chemistry, meteorology, the mining industry, and aeronautics are also presented. In general, before the revolution of 1905 in Ukraine, there was only one printing house that specialized in the publishing of books in Ukrainian. This was the printing house attached to the Scientific Society after Shevchenko. Before the beginning of World War I in 1914, there were about 20. In 1910, 17 publishing houses were in operation in eastern Ukraine, but they only occupied the 9th position in the Russian Empire, according to the number of Ukrainian editions. In Halachina, until the end of the 19th century, there were 11 publishing houses, and already at the beginning of the 20th century, there were more than 30. Second section, Index 8. Newspapers and magazines were printed at that time, which could produce about 2,000 sheets per hour. This was due to the printing machine constructed at the Augsburg factory. Forms, posters, etc. had been printed with the help of the crucible printing machines that had been operating 5 to 10 times faster than the earlier presses. Domestic books at the end of the 19th century possessed an important historical role in national culture, literature, and scientific progress, in spite of the fact that books were not available for the masses because of numerous government bans and the illiteracy of 2/3 of the Tsar's Russian population. Let's enter hall number 3 and stop to the right of the door. In this hall, our exposition tells of Ukrainian book printing in the 20th century and reminds us about the history of book printing by Ukrainian émigrés in Russia, the countries of Europe, North and South America, and Australia. Exhibits reveal contemporary topical subjects, such as books and Ukrainian statehood. Let us listen to the topic, the Revolutionary Revival Book. The revolutionary events of 1905 to 1907 in the Russian Empire, to which at those times most of Ukrainian territory belonged, weakened the Russian Tsar's prohibition of Ukrainian language book printing. As a result, in central Ukraine in 1905 to 1906, the first newspapers in Ukrainian were published. They were Chliborob, or grain grower, in the town of Lubny in the Poltava region, the newspaper Rada in Kiev, and the satirical magazine Shershen, or Hornet. Under the conditions of the revolutionary liberation movement in Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century, new publishing houses appeared. They were cooperative and private publishing houses that edited cheap books in Ukrainian. These editions, first of all, revealed the originality of Ukrainian culture, the developed education, and the highly formed national consciousness. We can also see the book by the well-known Ukrainian economist Serhiy Ostapenko, Course in Statistics and Demography. This was, for the first time, a printed and separate statistical account of Ukraine. In the chapter Sad Figures, the losses of the Ukrainian nation in World War I are shown. At the end of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century, original book graphics had been formed. Much is owed to the activity of the prominent artist, author of the original Ukrainian coat of arms, Professor Vasil Krychevsky. The master had created his own style based on the creative rethinking of folk art. In our showcase, the graphics of Vasil Krychevsky have been presented in the genre of a typical book cover. The peculiar contribution to Ukrainian book graphics were by the talented artist Georgy Narbut. He successfully combined features of the Byzantium culture, Ukrainian Baroque and folk art within magazine and book designs. The postcard, "The Printed Word Will Destroy the Darkness," eloquently tells about the significance of printing in Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. Book graphics of this period were noticeable for their stamps, print compositions, and different symbols. The Ukrainian language was of great importance for the revival of Ukrainian statehood. In the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian language was prohibited from developing fully, especially in the realm of scientific and technical terminology. In the 20s, research associates of the Ukrainian Language Institute of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine prepared for the printing of more than 30 dictionaries of terms. They'd completed a substantial collection of work. The folk names of handicrafts, instruments, agricultural equipment, medicines, traditions, and customs were recorded. At the Institute, they were scientifically processed and became the material for the formation of technical terms. In 1930s, the Stalin regime banned Ukrainian terminological dictionaries and were replaced by Russified substitutes. The authors of the original dictionaries were repressed and punished. Let's listen to the topic, the Book of the Overcoming of Illiteracy in Ukraine. In 1913, two-thirds of the Ukrainian population did not know how to read or write. Ukrainian publishing houses published school textbooks and textbooks for self-education in many copies. For example, Primer for Adults by Elkina, the Primer for Workers, The First Rung by Plaksin, The Visual Table for Studying Punctuation Marks by Ivan Ohyenko, the Ukrainian A-B-C book by Sofia Rusova, and other books helped to overcome illiteracy. Index 3b. We are listening to the topic, the Book and the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1920. In January 1918, Ukraine declared its independence and sovereignty and called itself the Ukrainian People's Republic. The parliament, the government, the monetary system, the army, and the diplomatic representatives in many countries had already been formed. The printed word helped to complete the revolution. In the showcase on the wall, the newspapers of the Ukrainian state of 1917 to 1919 are presented. The vertical showcase on the right presents Ivan Ohyenko, Ukrainian Culture. This book was edited in many copies and sent to soldiers of the Ukrainian People's Republic for the strengthening of their national views and fighting spirit. In 1920, this book was edited in many copies and sent to soldiers of the Ukrainian People's Republic for the strengthening of their national views and fighting spirit. In 1921, the army of the Ukrainian state was defeated by the troops of Bolshevik Russia. The Ukrainian Revolution sustained a serious defeat. The Ukrainian Revolution chronicles had been written by the adjutant of the main chieftain, the main commander of the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic, called Simon Petlura. The title of the first chapter of the book is Brother Fights His Brother, where the author showed the main reason of the defeat of the Ukrainian Revolution, that the Ukrainian nation had been divided between different fighting forces. In the independent Ukrainian state of 1918, the Academy of Sciences was founded, with its attached publishing house, where the first systematic publishing of scientific literature began. The publishing house edited the book telling of how, in the second half of the 17th century, 16 pages of the then unknown edition by Johannes Gutenberg, called Provincial Romanum, were found attached to the cover of the Bible printed by the French printer Etienne. This revelation took place in the Central Library of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. In the 1930s, the workers of the library were arrested, and as a result of the searches that took place, all the pages were lost. After the defeat of the Ukrainian Revolution, the nationally conscious intelligentsia that developed the Ukrainian state tried to rescue themselves from the Bolsheviks' repression by emigrating to various European countries, and thereby continuing Ukrainian book printing. In Vienna, Berlin, Prague and Warsaw, the centers of Ukrainian language book printing were established. So in Warsaw in the 30s, the works by Taras Shevchenko in 16 volumes were published, containing the literary as well as the artworks by the author. Let us listen to the topic Book Publishing in the Western Territories of Ukraine, in the vertical showcase. Until 1939, the western lands of Ukraine did not belong to the USSR, so Ukrainian book publishing developed according to market laws. In 1937, in Lviv, the geographical atlas of all the ethnical lands of Ukraine were edited by the professor Volodymyr Kubirovich. A model of such activity on a European scale was Ivan Tiktor in Lviv, whose portrait you can see on the wall, along with his private concern, the Ukrainian Press, which edited more than 400 books, as well as newspapers, magazines, calendars, and postcards. The editorial credo of Ivan Tiktor was to publish everything that was useful and wise for Ukraine. One of the Ukrainian national revival manifestations in the 1920s was the development of book studies. The Institute for Book Studies worked in Kiev, which investigated the history of Ukrainian books and book printing, reviewed new editions, published the magazine Bibliological News, and scientific collections. The art of the Ukrainian book was researched by the collector of great antiquities Danilo Sherabivsky. Published the magazine Bibliological News and scientific collections. The art of the Ukrainian book was researched by the collector of great antiquities Danilo Szczerbakivsky, whose portrait you can see upwards, and who committed suicide because of ideological oppression. In the 1930s, the official authorities considered the activity of the Institute for Book Studies to be harmful, and did everything it could to end its existence. We are listening to the topic Ukrainian printed word of the times of World War II. During World War II, on the western Ukrainian territories, the armed underground operated as well as the partisan Ukrainian insurgent army, which fought for the liberation of Ukraine from the Soviet Union as well as from Germany. On the walls, the printed materials of the National Liberation War are presented. These are underground newspapers and magazines, such as For Independent Ukraine, To Arms, Insurgent, as well as leaflets designed in the forest camps by the artist Nil Kasevich, with the portraits of the writers Oleg Olzich and Olena Teliha, who were killed by Hitler's Gestapo. During Soviet times, hundreds of Ukrainian books were officially banned and their authors arrested. Here we showcase editions of the lifetimes of repressed Ukrainian writers of the 1920s to 1930s. We continue the topic of the printed word of World War II. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, all the state publishing houses were evacuated from Ukraine into the depths of Russian territory. War books about heroic deeds of Ukrainians at the Soviet-German front are exhibited. Works by Shevchenko were used for strengthening the fighting spirit of soldiers. His collection of poems, Kobzar, in the vertical showcase, were printed in 1942. The edition was of 100,000 copies and was sent to the front. After World War II, book printing started to intensify in Ukraine. Comprehensive encyclopedias, dictionaries and reference books were published for the first time. The big explanatory dictionary of the Ukrainian language in 11 volumes, History of Cities and Villages in Ukraine in 26 volumes, horizontal showcase, the first in the world Cybernetics Encyclopedia in 2 volumes, also in the horizontal showcase, Ukrainian Language Atlas, Index 5, Encyclopedia of Ukraine, also in the horizontal showcase, were among them. In 1960 to 1970, the samizdat, or disambiguation, played an important role in the existence of the national liberation movement. These were anti-Soviet articles, as well as fiction, that were printed secretively without any censure control. Hand-printing machines, photocopies, and pasted texts on linoleum were used in quantity. The works by Ivan Dzyuba, Yevhen Sverstyuk, Vyacheslav Chornovil, and their reprints abroad are exhibited here. Index 6b. In the 4 showcases, the bibelots that have been exhibited evoke a special interest for readers. Booklets of the Eminence Miracle of Miracles is shown in 2 variants. The smaller of them is 0.9 centimeters high and 0.7 centimeters wide. It contains quotes by the Russian writers Pushkin and Gorky about the significance of the book. Index 7. We are listening to the topic Book Printing of the Ukrainian Diaspora. This introduces a mass of historical and cultural material prohibited in the Soviet Union, yet substantially adds to the history of contemporary Ukraine. This book has been published by Ukrainians in France. This is the history of the Ukrainian nationalist organization that fought for the liberation of Ukraine in the times of World War II, and nowadays has worked for the development of the Ukrainian state. The novel by Ulas Samchuk called Maria and printed in Buenos Aires is a vivid story about the Holodomor in Ukraine of 1933. The novel by the prominent Ukrainian writer and publicist Ivan Baherane called Tiger Catchers was printed in Germany in 1947. In this book, the hard destiny of a Ukrainian who was the prisoner of the Stalinist regime has been vividly depicted. Index 8b. In our horizontal showcase is a rare gift for the museum from the King's Library of Belgium. This is the book in French called Liber Liborum, which presents the art of the World Book within the last 5,000 years. In the octagonal showcase in the middle, diverse book forms can be seen. The history of the book stretches back 500 years within which its change is formed. There are clay tables of the ancient Sumerians, papyrus rolls of Egypt, Chinese book screens, Green and Roman codes that were pages formed into piles, book codes that have been known in Ukraine since the 9th century. This form of the book is still used nowadays. Book codes of the 18th century in their leather bindings are exhibited. Examples of Hebrew parchment rolls and the sacred texts of the Israelites called the Torah are also present. Index 9b. The production of contemporary books is rather complicated. Its first element, the setting, protects and decorates the book. The titles, illumination, and a tall piece divide the book into parts and help to guide the reader. The title page is the original introduction to the book, and normally contains the name of the author's work. Varied title pages of editions from the 17th to the 20th centuries are in the horizontal showcases. Half titles are pages with the titles of chapters, illumination, and initials, and mark the beginning of chapters. They add to the content of the book and decorate it with illustrations created by artists with a brush or a chisel. The important elements of the composition of an edition are prints, cursive in an ancient book, and a product of the printing house. For blind readers, the texts are printed in dot relief, originally invented by the French pedagogue Braille. Considerable work goes into the process of book production. Publishers work out the project and artists paint illustrations. Forms for printing and illustrations are made in a printing house. Out of the separate printed pages, notebooks are formed, and out of notebooks blocks are sewn together. The setting is fixed to the block, and so creating a most remarkable human invention. All over the world books are a mirror of time. You are now familiar with the history of Ukrainian books, and that over a number of centuries prohibitions and oppressions failed to destroy the art and scientific standards which were the guide for the Ukrainian nation on its way towards cultural, technical, and social progress. Thank you for your attention.